It is thunderstorming. The thing about reviewing a memoir is, who am I to judge the way another person tells their own story? You know? I personally believe that if you don't take a single thing away from another person's story, you had to have been completely committed to misunderstanding them or simply not tried hard enough. Obviously, there are people whose experiences we resonate with more than others, but there is always something to be learned, even if it's in the subtext. Madison Beer released her memoir, The Half of It, earlier this week. I got my hands on the special edition that Target released because it claims to have exclusive content. What exactly that means, I'm not sure, but we'll find out together because today we will be reading and reviewing it together. I can't imagine that you aren't, but if you're not familiar with Madison Beer, she is a singer slash songwriter who has been in the public eye since she was about 12 years old, who has shared publicly that she lives with borderline personality disorder and has shared a fair amount about how she navigates that in her daily life. Now, do I believe that she has been afforded an extraordinary amount of privilege because of her status? Undoubtedly. Do I also believe that she is a human being with a story worth sharing? Of course, yeah. Thus, if you are watching this to answer the question of whether or not the book is worth the read, I do recommend that you pick it up if you are able and find out for yourself. We are two different people with two completely different perspectives and inevitably different biases, so it is very likely that we will have two different opinions. This is of course subject to interpretation, but it is a relatively short book at 160 pages, so it's not like you're picking up the entire Harry Potter series and then waiting to see if you like it after combing through thousands and thousands of pages. You know what I mean? Something that I have to say I am excited about is testing out the journal prompts that she included. I think it's a valuable way to make the experience more interactive for the reader while also showing something that the author is passionate about. Because of the nature of her celebrity, I have decided not to make this a spoiler-free reading vlog because I do anticipate that over the next few days, there will be quite a lot of spoilers circulating the internet. Lastly, if you are interested in reading more book reviews or just find that we have a similar reading style or thought process, you're welcome to check out my Goodreads. I'll have it linked in the description box. Anyway, with that, let's get reading. First things first, we've got to unwrap her. I do keep dust jackets, but I'm not a fan of reading with them on. For anyone who might be curious, to my knowledge, this book is not sold in a paperback version. That could change, I could stand corrected, but I could not find one. On the front, we've got a current photo of her. Spine is pretty simple. It is her name, the title, and the publisher. On the back, she included a photo of herself from her childhood. I do know that we can anticipate her sharing some intimate details about her mental health journey, and within that realm, it's safe to say that healing your inner child is a very common theme for people, myself included, so I resonate with that. I think it's a really pretty touch. Oh, I was not expecting the blue. This surprises me. The embossing is a rose gold color. I just think it's a little bit random when you place it side by side with the dust jacket. I don't mind it, it's cute, and obviously not the most important part. Okay, so it looks like the Target exclusive is a mini segment at the end of the book called Mirror Moments. I don't want to look into it too much because if it's a spoiler, I don't want to read it, but it is titled From Lena. It looks like a letter. I wonder if this is a letter from a fan, possibly? Skimming through, it looks like these are screenshots of an Instagram account, maybe some DMs. This one says from Madison. Oh, so I wonder if this is sort of a pen pal situation. That's cute. Okay, well, that's what you're getting if you go for the Target version. There are 15 chapters. The first one titled The Half of It. The last one titled Everything Happens for a Reason. Let me just. That fresh book smell is gonna do it for me every single time. I do want to insert a quick trigger warning here. This book does discuss mental health, suicide, suicidal ideation. I always have links in the description box for resources that can help yourself or someone that you love. I will also do my best to edit this in a way where I can give you warnings if I'm going to be discussing that topic or debriefing from her mentioning that topic. Take what you need from this video and leave what you do not. This is a safe space for you. Let's carry on. Do I need another coffee just because I'm reading a book? I feel like the only logical answer is yes. I want to use my Christmas mug for the dramatics, for the comfort, really. Let me not undermine my feelings, okay? But I don't want a warm coffee. I want an iced coffee. You can do iced coffee in a mug. I make the rules. Is this not the most perfect book reading weather. Are you kidding? How dreamy. One thing about me is I will be lighting absolutely every single candle in the house and putting on coffee shop ambience while I do literally anything. Anything at all. I just don't think there's any other acceptable way of being, you know? About 15% through the book. We have approached the first journal prompt. So let's retrace our steps, address a couple things, and then hop in and do that one together. She experiences fame and subsequently privilege at a scale that the majority of the population will never be able to comprehend. I was pleasantly surprised by the fact that this privilege was the first thing that she addressed in the book. It was literally the preface. On the next page, she addresses something pretty important to me and something that I think a lot of memoirs allude to inadvertently, just like by the nature of writing a memoir. But because of the nature of the internet, we are under the impression that we know everything, and then when we get a little tidbit, we're like, oh no, now we know everything. She says, I'm the most openly honest I've ever been in the following pages, but that isn't to say I talk about everything I've been through in this book. No matter how much you think you know me, there will always be parts of my story that are for me and me only. That's kind of the point. You never know everything, even when you think you might. I like this because while I can appreciate the power of sharing our stories and the impact that they can have on other people, I also don't believe in doing so at the expense of your own healing. And I think when you're writing a memoir and there's all of this anticipation about it, and you're this person who feels like they've been misunderstood for such a long time, I would imagine that there can be this pressure to give everything away to everyone, to almost validate the struggles that you've had and say, this is everything that you had no idea about. But I think it takes much more humility to say, this is the tip of the iceberg, the rest of it doesn't belong to you, and I'm not ready to give it to you, and I shouldn't have to tell you that I'm struggling in order for you to be kind to me. She actually says something along those lines. She says, you'll never walk in my shoes and I'll never walk in yours, and we shouldn't have to in order to empathize with each other. Good for her for standing in her power and keeping some of that for herself, when I'm sure there was pressure from maybe the publisher or her management or people in her life, or even if it was just the voice in her head telling her that she had to over disclose in order to make this book juicy. Secrets sell. So good for her. Good for her for standing in that power. Another note I made was in chapter 5, mob mentality, trigger warning. She elaborates on that idea of not oversharing. She tells us about these traumatic events that have happened to her very briefly, enough for you to know that they've happened, but sets a boundary that that's as far as she wants to go about it. So let me elaborate. Again, trigger warning. I've never spoken about what I am about to say publicly, and even though I have so much to say about it, the reason it's not a major topic in this book is because I'm still learning to be patient with myself and put my healing first. It is not a part of my story that deserves to be ignored, but I don't think I'm ready to go into too much detail. The trauma from those incidents still affects me daily. I believe it will be a part of me forever. Whew. Yeah, so again, beautiful boundary setting and obviously so heartbreaking. This brings us to where we are now. She closes off that chapter by talking about her anxiety. And I feel like these days, because anxiety is such an ever-present issue in our society that just keeps growing and multiplying, it's very hard to find advice that does not sound cliche or patronizing. But I actually found what she had to say about it really refreshing. And maybe it's just the fact that sometimes you have to hear something a certain way or from a certain person or in a certain set of words in order for it to hit. But this really, I thought this was good. She says, I set small goals just to prove to my brain and my body that positive experiences can come from facing your fears. If I'm scared about going to a party with a bunch of people I don't know, I tried to make it a mission to have a good conversation with one stranger, to walk away from that night with at least one positive memory. So the next time I enter a room full of strangers, I can say to myself, hey, the last time you did this, you made a friend. These are small victories, but they are victories regardless. It's funny because as a person who's had a lot of therapy, you can tell when other people have had a lot of therapy. Anyways, this brings us to the first journal prompt, and that says, tell me about a time that your anxiety was proven wrong. Hold on to it. Is there something you're anxious about now that you could try and combat in a manageable, healthy way? If so, then what? Understanding the root of our anxieties detail by detail, broken down in my experience, can help a lot. Deconstruct it, prove it wrong. I provided that prompt on the screen for you so that you have access to it, whether or not you have the means to obtain this book. I hope that that one or some of the next ones are helpful for you. For the sake of making you feel encouraged, I'm gonna challenge myself to share one of my own experiences. So, maternal anxiety was proven wrong. I mean, honestly, I think that this happens quite frequently. I think this is why a mantra that I try to have is what is the best that could happen, because as somebody who, as I've recently shared, navigates life with the diagnosis of CPTSD, I am very hyper vigilant, and I want to emphasize the importance of choosing the word hypervigilance instead of paranoia. So naturally, because that is a factor of my life, I am quick to observe the smallest things and panic about my safety and the safety of the world around me. So for example, I tend to have a lot of movie theater anxiety. I think apart from the diagnoses that I struggle with, in the most heartbreaking way, it makes sense to be someone who is fearful of gun violence in this country. We have seen far too many displays of it and far too much complacency in the reprimanding of it and the change facilitated afterwards to feel safe. So every time I go into a movie theater, I am sweaty, I am shaky, I am nervous, I am short of breath, I am 1 foot out the door. I am looking for any small indicator that I am unsafe, and I'm bolting out of that theater. But there are certain things that I do to make myself feel safer, whether that be choosing a specific seat, studying the floor plan before I get there, knowing where all the exits are, making sure someone else apart from who I'm with knows I'm at the movie theater, fully assessing the faces of people that walk by me so that I could give a sketch if I needed to. Things of that sort help to bring me solace. And even though it is absolutely terrifying to get through it, every time I leave completely unscathed, I feel so proud of myself. Now, that's an example that feels a little bit insensitive because it's not just anxiety, it is a very real concern in this world and specifically this country that we live in. But that is just the first thing that came to mind for me because it really weighs on me. So, I mean, there's not really a way to prove that one wrong because it's a real risk, but there are ways that I can walk myself back from panicking and suffering when I don't have to. That's the big thing. So let's carry on. I've been waiting for this one. I think we've all been waiting for this one. In chapter 6, she recounts the time that her privacy was violated and private photos of her were leaked and distributed when she was 15 years old, which, mind you, is child pornography. I am somebody who has a very deep appreciation for anger. As someone who was afraid of anger for a very long time and then went on their own personal journey with it through my own mental health journey, I believe in the power of a person being angry in a healthy way and working through that anger, but stepping into that anger and stepping into that power and moving through it to get to a healthier place. But for the sake of this conversation, first of all, I can't imagine having my privacy violated in such a way, also at such a young age, also on such a grand scale. And I really sympathize with her. I mean, I feel like I wish I could cradle her. I remember this time on the internet. I mean, this might be an overgeneralization, but I feel like if you were on the internet, you heard about when this happened. She talks about being angry with the adults in her life for not protecting her. She talks about the internalized misogyny that she carried with her for a long time and still struggles with to this day. And she addresses the greater conversation of the fact that she should never have been shamed as a young woman exploring her sexual identity. Instead, the person who should have faced consequences was the person who violated her trust. She says, "I didn't know it at the time, but it's indicative of a bigger problem. Misogyny is woven so deeply into our society that everyone's first reaction was to be disgusted by me, by the fact that a young girl would even think of exploring her sexuality. If I was a boy, it would have been different. The reaction would have been, oh God, poor kid, he must be so embarrassed. If I was a boy and it was a girl who leaked the photo of me, she would be the one blamed, called psycho, manipulative, and vindictive. If I was a boy, I would have been shielded from the consequences of my actions and allowed to move on from my mistake." Period! But I was a girl and I wasn't allowed to be sexual even when all of my friends were doing the same thing behind closed doors. Yes, I was underage, I was young, and that's what complicates it. But developmental psychology agrees that early adolescence is when we start exploring our sexuality. By those standards, I was progressing age appropriately by doing something as simple as having curiosity about my own body. Sending the video to a boy wasn't the best idea, but that's not what people were mad about. They were shocked that I, a female, was expressing any sort of sexual autonomy. No one's rage was coming from a place of concern. None of the backlash online was to protect me from being exploited or to educate me about sexual health, consent, or internet safety. No, I was being shamed for being sexual in general. My peers were making fun of me for trying to be sexy. People were joking about something that was so traumatic for me, and it was even more difficult as a young girl with past sexual traumas. I'd already had my bodily autonomy and my trust betrayed, and now here it was again being broadcast for the world to see. At the end of the day, I should have been protected, and if I had been, it would have saved me years of damage. Instead, I faced the harsh reality of internalized misogyny and what it means to be female in a world that prioritizes male sexual desire. Period. She said that. I commend her for leaning into that anger and taking accountability for the fact that obviously it wasn't a smart move, but she was a child. That's not the point. The point is that her trust was violated and we're not having a greater conversation. I mean, we're having that conversation more now, but at the time we weren't having a greater conversation of internet safety and not doing shitty things to people who trust you intimately, and not victim blaming. Good for her for recognizing that it was the adults in her life responsibility to protect her. It should not have been her responsibility to be finding links to scrub from the internet and like going into chat rooms and seeing grown men talk about her. Those are not things that she should have been responsible for. Those things should have been taken care of by an adult. So I commend her for leaning into that anger and saying this should not have been my responsibility. And then I also just have so much profound admiration for the way that she's able to have empathy. Like, she talks about the way that adults in her life have disappointed her, but then she also is able to acknowledge that they did the best they could at the time with what they knew, and that it was new for everyone, not just her, and it was difficult to navigate for her parents as well as herself. That's a lot of empathy to have for someone who is disappointed by the people who are supposed to protect you. Let's carry on, shall we? Okay, we've made it to our second journal prompt. It is playlist of my life. I'm really excited about this. So there are 7 parts to this prompt, I guess you could say. 1, a song I connected with on my first listen. 2, a song that reminds me of my childhood. 3, a song that calms me down. 4, a song for driving with the windows down. 5, a song I know every word to. 6, a song that reminds me of my best friend. 7, a song that makes me feel less alone. That's cute. I have to think about this one. I'll put them on the screen while I'm editing as I do this. All right, chapter 8, inner child. Let's go, let's do it. I'm on page 52, so we're almost halfway there. Okay, we've made it to journal prompt number 3. What? Number 3. It's called Reconnecting with Your Inner Child. I'm excited for this one. So she says, sometimes in the process of growing up, we fall out of touch with ourselves. It's important to try to reconnect with that inner child and all the things we loved instinctually before the world told us who we had to be. How did you define yourself as a child? As you've grown, how has that changed? Have you lost any interests or traits that you'd like to get back? What parts of yourself do you long to reconnect with? If you could write a letter to your inner child, what would you say? That's a lot.
Got to chapter 10. There's a kitten spying on me.
We just got to journal prompt number 4. But before we get into that, there's a couple things to touch base on. Trigger warning. She just got through talking about a suicide attempt she made in 2019 that was unsuccessful. And while that's obviously a very serious thing, I appreciate the way that she wrote about it in such a nonchalant way to highlight the nonchalance of her attitude at that time. And also the way that she explained it in such an anticlimactic way to again highlight the fact that nothing in her life immediately changed, and healing is in fact a very lengthy and tedious process. After her suicide attempt, she wakes up, realizes it was unsuccessful, and legitimately has the same day that she has been having for months at this point. Wakes up, goes to the studio, does her normal routine, and doesn't come to terms with it until many hours later when she returns home from the day. There's a part in that chapter where she says, you know, in the movies, after an unsuccessful attempt, you reach the part where the person wakes up in a hospital surrounded by their loved ones, and this is their wake-up call, and they are set off on the right track from this point forward. She very honestly discloses that that is not what happened in her case. It took her a very long time to actually initiate change, which is real and is brave, I think, to admit to the general public. She then talks about her journey starting therapy and how she was reluctant to it. However, now she believes that every single person on the planet should be in therapy, which I think tends to be the general consensus after you've done it for a while. That, again, is a privileged thing and not everybody has access to it. LOL. And then she shares a small conversation she had with her therapist in which her therapist is trying to get her to realize that she has PTSD, and her response is so condescending toward herself. She will not accept that she has trauma. She will not accept that that's a diagnosis that belongs to her and that she deserves. That was eerily familiar. There is a difference between PTSD and CPTSD. Again, I have recently shared that I live with CPTSD, so that is an experience that I resonate with in a way that is comical. Anyways, you have to cling to the humor, you know? Sometimes it's all you have. Anyways, I also like how she talks about being afraid to get better. As I've recently shared, I was in treatment earlier this year. That was a concern that I struggled with a lot at the time and still do sometimes, but her thoughts on it are really beautiful. She says, once I knew what rock bottom felt like, I wanted every precaution in place to ensure I would never wind up there again. But just because I was more aware of the things I was dealing with, that didn't mean I was automatically healed. At the time, I thought that because I was putting work in, I was ensuring I would never go back to that low point. So when I had a bad day or even a bad week, I was terrified that I was slipping back into a dark place I couldn't get out of. But that isn't how it works. It took me a while to realize getting better isn't about preventing myself from ever encountering negative emotions. It's about building my toolkit and having practices in place so that I can handle the lows better. It's about understanding that experiencing those bad days doesn't mean I'm reverting or losing progress, but simply that I'm human. It's all a balance. Healing isn't linear. I kind of hate that quote, healing isn't linear, because I feel like it's just been bastardized by the internet, but the sentiment is there. Not the most profound thing in the world, but it is affirming. This brings us to journal prompt number 4. It is a letter to self. In a year from now, where do you want to be? What will you wish you had started today? Sorry, I put my glasses on. Now, write a letter to yourself as you were a year ago. How have you grown since? Tiny victories are still victories. What have you learned? What have you overcome? Let's carry on, shall we? Hello, we've finished the book. I did not check in with you for the second half of it because truthfully there wasn't much to check in about. I found that the last 30 to 50% of it covered the same topics pretty extensively. If this was not a memoir and I didn't think people were entitled to tell their stories in a way that feels authentic to them, I would critique that this felt like an essay with a lot of filler words. The same point was dragged out for far too long. That could just be the author's way of emphasizing how important that topic is to them. But as a reader, I found myself counting how many pages I had left until the next chapter. She discussed what it's been like to be the subject of public perception, how that has rewired her brain, as she says, to be geared more towards paranoia, how that has impacted her close relationships, whether they be platonic or romantic or familial or whatever the case may be. She shares a couple stories, one in particular being a night where she accidentally overdosed. She was so worried about the optics of an ambulance coming to her house and that news potentially construed that she could not prioritize her own need for medical care without the insistence of her loved ones. I thought it was interesting to hear her perspective on fame and being a person who lives that kind of life. The book was published less than a week ago, so there aren't very many reviews to read, but one of the reviews that I did see pop up on Goodreads was that this reader critiqued the lack of material in the memoir that addressed certain situations the public has been aware of. I can understand that, and I do also feel surprised by it, but I can't say that as a reader we're entitled to be disappointed by those things. They are the remnants of someone else's life, and whether or not they're comfortable excavating that and displaying them for the entire world to see is completely up to them. But yeah, I will say that I was generally surprised at the lack of her going into detail about her past relationships and even some of her past friendships. I do understand that that can get sticky though, because, you know, name dropping, and we don't know what kind of drama that could start in her own personal life, and at a certain point you just kind of want to get past things. So I understand that. And I will say that I would imagine a part of it is probably that no one wants to be known for who they've dated or who they've been friends with. People want to be known for who they are. So I can imagine, just from the perspective of a person who identifies as female in a world like this one, who's been in the public eye since she was a preteen, the way it feels belittling to be expected to overshare about your romantic partnerships. Would it have been cool to get a little bit more detail? Yes, of course. Do I understand why we didn't? 100%. She's more than the people that she has loved. Moving forward on the topic of people that she's loved, we do end up finding out that the name Lena that I mentioned at the beginning of the book is the name of her best friend that she met over the internet. She talks a lot about how this friendship with Lena has taught her what true friendship is. It's taught her the real value and real feeling of reciprocity. And I think it is so beautiful to discuss how important platonic relationships are in our life and how much female friendships particularly can positively impact our lives. However, I do worry that the way in which she discusses how much she loves Lena and how much has changed in her life since she met Lena could be portrayed to her impressionable audience as being too reliant on one person for your healing, for your emotional stability, and for a sense of love. Now, she doesn't explicitly make this point. She doesn't, you know, say that her entire world revolves around this one person. She does have other friends and family, and she has a partner to my knowledge, but I do worry about the way that it's phrased when she talks about her, and the way that that can be, like I said, interpreted by her audience that is primarily younger teenage people. But ultimately, that is just my perspective on it. That is also just my perspective from reading it one time. Maybe if I picked up the book again in, let's say, 2 months, I would read that differently. And ultimately, I don't know their friendship. Ultimately, it can sound like whatever it sounds like, but a person is not going to do the work to heal unless they truly want to. So the fact that she is doing that work is a testament to the fact that she does have a good balance between being self-reliant and relying on her community. So it doesn't really matter if it came across that way to me the first time I read it. Of course, we passed a few more prompts. I will insert them here on the screen so that you can do them yourself if you would like to try them at home. And lastly, I will say that I think it was a nice touch for her to include a lot of segments where she responded to questions from her fans. You see that more in the second half of the book. I know that she does claim to have a very close relationship with her fans and feel very connected to them. I think there is the parasocial factor of it all, but ultimately it does show an appreciation for the people who support her and have contributed to her getting where she is. Overall, I do think there were some important themes in the book. She becomes more comfortable advocating for her creative ideas and speaking up in rooms full of people who otherwise would kind of push past her train of thinking. She talks about how to navigate this world where there seems to be a lack of balance between coming off as too assertive and coming off too spineless, for lack of better terms. It is important, again, because she has such a young and impressionable audience, to hear that from somebody that you admire. And of course, ultimately the theme that there is always hope to be found in helping other people and leaning into your community. I think it's really beautiful for her to reaffirm this idea that we're seeing more and more often, that in a world where we're taught that our purpose should be woven into the fabrics of capitalism and should be associated with something productive and career focused, that our purpose can be geared more towards simply existing and sharing special moments with other people. So to recap, I would give this book 2 to 3 stars, most likely. I don't really rate books because it's it requires too much overthinking on my part. There's so many different factors and then I get overwhelmed trying to give it a rating. Especially with memoirs, again, who am I to rate the way another person tells their own story? But I typically reserve 4 or 5 stars for books that really impacted me in a very significant way and taught me a lot that I never would have otherwise known. This did not meet that criteria, but I do think it was special, and I do think it is always worthwhile to have more stories in the world, specifically stories from women under a patriarchal society. Would I recommend it? Sure. I would probably recommend it to a younger audience, more likely to someone in their teen years than someone in their 20s/30s. But I do think that it has some healthy reminders for people who are in their 20s, and I think that it can be good perspective for anyone who just needs a reminder about being confident in their femininity, exploring sexuality, not carrying shame that doesn't belong to them, taking charge of their mental health, and building a community. I will say that as a piece of literature, as a body of written work, it wasn't very complex. It's very possible that that is intentional because of the nature of her audience being younger, and it could also be for the purpose of making sure that the information is more accessible and easily understandable to a wider range of people, and I think there's something special to be said about that. All in all, I would read it again. I thought it was interesting. Clearly, I thought it was interesting enough to read in a day. I have heard amazing things about listening to the audiobook. From what I understand, she narrates it herself, which I would imagine would be very satisfying for the experience of a memoir. But yeah, if you have read it, let me know your thoughts. I am super curious. I do have to say, I feel like I tried throughout this video to be as respectful and honest and fair as possible. If this is your favorite book, if you enjoyed it a lot more than I did, if you are a big fan of hers, none of my opinions were intended to be a personal attack. It's possible that my opinions will change as the dust settles, and ultimately you are allowed to have a different opinion than I do. I'm sure she's great. This has nothing to do with her. Anyway, thank you for watching. Thank you for being here. I look forward to reading with you again soon. Bye.
It was late at night. You tossed and